It's the land at the edge of the world, a howling emptiness of jagged mountains, broken icebergs, and endless snow. It's a song of ice and, well, more ice. A land that's the coldest, driest, windiest, and most uninhabitable place anywhere on Earth. Those who went there knew it as the Great White Silence, the southern land, the end of the world. But you know it by its far more ancient name, Antarctica. The last continent to be discovered, Antarctica was for a long time a mystery shrouded in ice. For centuries, the ferocious southern ocean stopped even the hardiest of explorers from catching just a glimpse of this frozen land. Today, of course, Antarctica has been tamed. There's a population of scientists, visits by tour groups, and you can even take yoga classes at the pole. But how did we get here? How did we conquer Antarctica? And why does no country own it today? Well, in today's video, we're embarking on an epic voyage to the edge of the Earth. In the early 2nd century AD, Marinus of Tyre made history. At the time, it was fashionable to believe that the known world was not all that existed, that somewhere down south a vast continent might be hiding, just waiting to be discovered. To this hidden world, Marinus gave it the name we know it by today, Antarctica. But while Marinus christening Antarctica makes for a fine point to start a video on the subject, the actual history of Antarctica, it of course begins much earlier. How much earlier? Well, try about 600 million years ago. In the late Precambrian era, the endless shifting of tectonic plates resulted in the appearance of a landmass known as Gondwana. An ancient supercontinent, Gondwana was absolutely huge. Just listen to the modern-day places that made up Gondwana. South America, Africa, Arabia, India, Madagascar, Australia. I mean, all of these are places that themselves are pretty ridiculously big. At the heart of this landmass was Antarctica, but don't go thinking that it was anything like the Antarctica that you know today. Plant fossils tell the story of an Antarctica covered in lush rainforest. Even when Gondwana disintegrated and Antarctica began its lonely voyage south, it remained hot and humid and just bustling with life. Dinosaurs roamed the plains of the interior, forests covered the mountains. At Antarctica's edges, 6-foot-tall penguins waddled around, presumably looking both adorable and terrifying at the same time. This stayed true even as Antarctica settled over the pole, isolated from the other continents. It stayed true even as hundreds of millions of years just sped by. Then, 35 million years ago, the first icy sheets unexpectedly appeared. Quite how they formed is a bit of a mystery. What's not in doubt is that they were soon growing to cover the continents. As the ice sheets grew, life around them began to shrink away. It happened slowly, in fact so slowly it would have been impossible to detect, yet, well, happen it did. As the millennia slipped past, life found itself pushed further and further to the edges. The forests retreated, larger forms of life were pushed into extinction. Eventually, all that remained of tropical Antarctica was a narrow ring around the coast, a narrow band of life clinging to the edges of an inhospitable wasteland. But even that couldn't last. Around 3 million years ago, Antarctica reached a tipping point. The cycles of gentle warming that had kept the last ice sheets at bay, they simply stopped. The continent, it plunged into deep freeze. Sheets of ice 3 kilometers thick covered its surface. Last traces of life, it just vanished. Finally, the Antarctica we know today had arrived. A couple of million years later, a group of bipedal apes in Africa evolved brains big enough to make themselves the top of the food chain. They moved out of Africa, discovered things like writing and geography, and settled around the Eastern Mediterranean. Eventually, a civilization we know as ancient Greece arose. Its geographers became the first to speculate that there might be another land to the south that was hidden from view. In the twilight of the Hellenistic era, an ape known as Marinus finally came up with a name for that land, and he called it Antarctica. For the next several hundred years, Antarctica remained a figment of our imaginations. The idea that there was another land to the south, it was still popular. In the Middle Ages, mapmakers even began including a vast blank supercontinent over the South Pole. Incidentally, in those days, the fabled southern land was mostly known as Terra Australis Incognita, but the discovery of Australia kind of used up that name, so, well, it flipped back to Antarctica. Despite appearing on maps, no one had ever seen Antarctica. The closest anyone came prior to the 19th century was the legendary explorer James Cook. Well, probably. There is a Maori legend about an ancient war canoe that got blown off course and wound up in a sea of ice around Antarctica, but that's pretty difficult to prove. Anyway, Cook spent the years 1772 to 1775 circumnavigating the globe at high southern latitudes, meaning he basically went in a perfect circle around Antarctica without ever quite seeing it. What he did see were fur seals, and lots of them. And so we come to the first stage of the great human story of discovering somewhere cold and new and, well, exploiting the living hell out of it. The sealing era lasted almost from the moment Cook returned home and said, "Guys, you won't believe how many seals there are down there," to around 1830 when there were almost no fur seals left at all. Hundreds of commercial ships from dozens of nations raced to the ice sheets surrounding Antarctica, trapping and killing as many seals as possible. In fact, they killed so many seals that it's been speculated that the first person to set foot on Antarctica may not have been some heroic explorer, but rather an anonymous sailor who was too busy whacking a seal on the head to notice that it made history. Still, the romance of an undiscovered land, it gripped the public imagination. By 1798, talk of Antarctica was prevalent enough that Samuel Taylor Coleridge used it as the setting for his epic poem Rime of the Ancient Mariner. The tale of a vessel blown off course that winds up in Antarctica, Rime is chiefly remembered today for boring literary students with its bizarre obsession with albatrosses. But its invocation of Antarctica is still haunting. Lacking any sightings to draw on, Coleridge created a land covered in jagged sheets of green ice that appeared like a wasteland of broken glass. It was a fantastical image, one that captured the minds of many. However, it was about to be replaced by the real deal. In 1820, 3 men from different ships, registered to 3 different nations, all became the first ever to see Antarctica. Like characters in a fairy tale, each man witnessed a fragment more and uncovered a little extra. The first was Russian naval officer Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen, who caught sight of a shelf edge of continental ice. Not 2 days later, the second man, British expedition leader Edward Bransfield, caught sight of terra firma that may have been part of the mainland. Finally, American Nathaniel Palmer saw the mainland itself rising from the frozen seas, distant and terrifying. But rather than live happily ever after, all 3 men then spent the rest of their lives squabbling over who saw Antarctica first. Still, the veil had been lifted. Humanity had confirmed a whole other land existed at the South Pole. Now, all we needed to do was actually visit the damn place. If you need an illustration of how mystifying 19th century people found Antarctica, look no further than Edgar Allan Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. An 1838 novel about a group of mutineers caught on a lifeless ship. The tale climaxes with the survivors reaching Antarctica. There, they find not only a tropical microclimate beyond the ice, but other humans and, eventually, a gigantic white figure that may be protecting the entrance to a hollow Earth. It sounds ridiculous now, but in Poe's time, it was no crazier than any of the other theories about Antarctica. Decades after Nathaniel Palmer's 1820 sighting, people were still arguing over what Antarctica really looked like. It could be a tropical rainforest surrounded by a barrier of ice. It could be a series of islands rather than one giant landmass. It could house gods, demons, monsters, whatever humanity wanted. It helps that the 19th century mostly saw explorers get close to, but never quite land on Antarctica. That all finally changed in 1895. That year, a half-English, half-Norwegian man with the glorious name of Carsten Edgeberg Borchgrevink managed to do what no one else had done before. He landed a boat at Cape Adare, a grim and lonely little peninsula poking out of Antarctica. As he stepped onto shore, he became the first person in recorded history to stand on Antarctic soil. Well, at least that's Borchgrevink's version. Aboard the ship was 17-year-old New Zealander Alexander von Tulselman, who maintained until his death that he was first out the ship and first to actually touch Antarctic soil. And no, 19th century explorers were not very good at sharing. Whoever was first on land, there was no doubt that Borchgrevink's mission marked the beginning of the scramble for Antarctica. The era that Borchgrevink ushered in is commonly known as the heroic age of exploration, mostly thanks to guys like Scott, Shackleton, and Amundsen. But before we can discuss their excellent adventures, we have to walk you through something we're going to call Carsten Borchgrevink's Bogus Journey. After either landing on Antarctica first or landing on it second and then stealing all the credit, Borchgrevink was itching to get back down south. In 1898, a Belgian captain had accidentally gotten trapped in Antarctic ice over winter, thereby proving you could survive the punishing cold, and Borchgrevink was determined to be the first to do it intentionally. In 1899, he returned to the southern continent and built the hut now recognized as Antarctica's first permanent structure. Then he and his men settled down for winter. It would be the longest winter any of them had ever experienced. As hurricane-force winds howled outside and temperatures dropped to levels that brass monkeys have nightmares about, Borchgrevink and his men, they sank into acute cabin fever. The whole hut stank of penguin droppings. The only food available was penguin meat. Fuel meant wading through thick guano to catch another damn penguin. Everything was permeated with the stench of penguin poo, penguin flesh, and burning penguin fat. Tempers frayed, a fire nearly burned the hut down, and one man fell ill and he died. By the end, Borchgrevink wrote that the bitter silence between the men was deafening. Still, Borchgrevink, he did the job. By going, he sparked enough interest in Antarctica that another man was appointed to lead a British follow-up expedition. His name was Robert Falcon Scott, and he was about to go down in history. If you were alive in early 1911, it would have looked to you like the British were on the verge of conquering Antarctica. It was now 10 years since Scott's first expedition, the Discovery, had set off for the southern continent. In that short space of time, our conception of Antarctica, it had been transformed. While Borchgrevink had contented himself farting around the coast, eating any penguins he could get his hands on, Scott had led history's first trek into the Antarctic interior. He had mapped previously unknown mountain ranges, crossed the Ross Ice Shelf, then known as the Ice Barrier, explored the frozen plateau, and taken a hot air balloon up to make the first observations of the continent from the air. Nor was it just Scott. One of Scott's comrades on his Discovery expedition, a guy named Ernest Shackleton, returned for his own 1909 expedition, which saw him get within 97 miles of the South Pole. Commercially, too, Antarctica, it was opening up. In 1904, the first major whaling stations opened on the island of South Georgia, bringing fleets of vessels to the waters around the continent. From a land shrouded in mystery just 15 years earlier, Antarctica was suddenly becoming somewhere that we knew we could get to. It was somewhere where we knew we could survive. And so it was with a spirit of great optimism that Scott's second expedition to Antarctica set off from Cardiff in June of 1910. Known as Terra Nova, it had two goals. One was to advance scientific understanding of Antarctica. The other was to become the first to reach the South Pole. At the time he set off, Scott was pretty certain he would be able to achieve both goals. The only other person on Earth who could probably challenge Scott for the pole was a Norwegian dude called Roald Amundsen, and he was off doing his own thing at the North Pole. Or so Scott thought. When the Terra Nova arrived in New Zealand, Scott received a telegram from Amundsen effectively saying, "Sorry dude, decided to beat you to the South Pole. Good luck eating my dust." And with that, the race for Antarctica was on, but no one could have predicted that it would end in tragedy. The following January, 1911, Scott and his crew landed at Ross Dependency, where they established base camp. With winter approaching, there was no point racing for the pole, so the team settled in, doing their science stuff and chasing penguins for fun. Come October, Scott was ready to begin the grueling trek to the pole. This was a lesson in disaster. After 50 miles, the motorized sledges broke down and Scott was forced to switch to dogs, only for the dogs to start dying in droves. Incidentally, Amundsen's expedition had the same problem, but where Scott and his men felt sympathy for their exhausted dogs, Amundsen's crew ate them or fed them to the other dogs for energy. Scott's progress was painfully slow. All through December, he inched his way up glaciers and onto the empty plateau leading to the pole. By January the 3rd, it was clear that the team needed thinning. Scott selected Dr. Edward Wilson, Lawrence Oates, Henry Bowers, and Edgar Evans to accompany him for the final dash. Sadly, none of them would ever be seen alive again. On January 17, 1912, nearly 3 months after setting off, Scott's team finally reached the South Pole. A note from Amundsen was waiting for them. In a masterful burn, it simply asked Scott to inform the King of Norway that Amundsen had reached the pole first. The date of the letter was December 14th. Amundsen had won by 33 whole days. The return journey was as miserable as you're probably imagining. Frozen by unseasonable cold, battered by winds, the party limped back towards safety. As they descended the Byrd Glacier that February, Edgar Evans, he collapsed and died. Unable to take his corpse with them, the rest of the party, they carried on. But a hopelessness hung over all of them. They'd failed to reach the pole first, and now they'd pay the price. By March, Captain Oates had developed gangrene and was slowing everyone down. The night of his 32nd birthday, Oates told his companions, "I'm just going outside, and maybe some time," and walked out the tent and into a blizzard. His body was never found. On March the 20th, a blizzard pinned down the party just 11 miles from a supply depot. For over a week, the storm battered their tents, the gales outside sounding like mocking laughs. On March the 29th, Scott wrote his final diary entry. "Every day we have been ready to start for our depot, but outside the door of the tent it remains a scene of whirling drift. I do not think we can hope for any better things now. We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. R. Scott." Last entry. The death of Scott and his failure to reach the pole first came as a shocking blow to the British. Although Scott was elevated to the status of national hero, his story still shook the nation to its core. One of the reasons the party was so slow was that they refused to jettison the scientific samples that they'd picked up along the way. Unlike Amundsen, who didn't carry a single unnecessary pound, Scott was logging back a pile of fossils that he'd wasted a day collecting. These same fossils would later be used to prove that Antarctica had once been connected to South India and South America, and to prove Gondwana. Even in death, he was able to change science forever. The end of Scott, it wasn't the end of the heroic age, but it might as well have been. The next great expedition was also one that ended in failure when Ernest Shackleton's Endurance got stuck in pack ice in winter 1914 and starvation looked certain. But while Scott would die of exposure, Shackleton was able to pull off a crazy escape. In a small boat, he and a few men were able to row for 14 straight days across the hell of the Southern Ocean until they reached South Georgia. There, they walked for miles across frozen, jagged terrain before finally scaling down a sheer cliff to arrive at the safety of a whaling station. It was the sort of feat of endurance that would make your average ultra runner break down and weep. Yet, how did fate reward the men who made it? Well, it sent them all off to fight in the inferno that was World War I, out of the frying pan and, well, into the meat grinder. The real end of the heroic age came with the end of World War I. The war had seen innovations in aircraft that opened Antarctica up to aerial exploration for the first time. Teams of frostbitten men being pulled along by weary dogs, or in Amundsen's case, just eating those dogs, were replaced with guys in airplanes. In November of 1929, not 20 years after Scott's lonely death on the ice, Richard E. Byrd was able to fly over the South Pole and drop an American flag onto it. He was probably back at base camp in time for lunch. It was around now that the mystery of Antarctica had finally dissipated for good. In February and March of 1931, H.P. Lovecraft wrote what was probably the last great piece of speculative fiction about Antarctica. At the Mountains of Madness follows an expedition deep into the Transantarctic range where they discover the frozen ruins of an ancient alien city. But by then, the real Antarctica was already shrinking in human imagination. As technology developed, countries began staking their claims on the continent. They were planting a flag here, or maybe a sign there. In 1939, the German Antarctic expedition even flew a plane over Queen Maud Land. The scientists on board dropped large metal swastikas over the endless snow, claiming it for the eternal glory of Adolf Hitler. But it was in World War II's aftermath that Antarctica would really see its biggest expedition. In 1946, the US government became concerned that they had no basis for a territorial claim to Antarctica. What followed was Operation High Jump, a vast flotilla of ships that visited the southern land to map it more extensively than anyone had done before. 4,700 men spent countless hours monitoring and photographing Antarctica within an inch of its life. 49,000 aerial photos were taken, minutely mapping 60% of the coastline. The This is no mean feat when you realize Antarctica is the size of the whole of Europe and India combined. So I guess that's it then, right? The rest of the history of Antarctica is just technology improving and people taking more and more pictures until we get to the present day. Well, no. Not quite. Remember how we said in the introduction that no country today owns Antarctica? Well, there's a good reason for that, and it took humanity almost to the brink of World War III. It's often forgotten amid the stories of Amundsen and Scott, but the heroic age of Antarctic exploration also overlaps with another age, the age of colonization. From 1908, countries like Great Britain, New Zealand, Chile, Argentina, Australia, and South Africa all laid claim to vast tracts of Antarctic wilderness. While the US never formally claimed anywhere, it did pass a law refusing to recognize anyone else's claims. This left everyone with the not unreasonable feeling that the Yanks would soon come charging down and try to take everything. By the late 1940s, the situation had become unmanageable. On the peninsula near South America, particularly, the Argentines, Chileans, and British were all building research stations so obnoxiously close to one another that all three accused the others of spying. But if there was the potential for a local war to erupt over control of Antarctica, there was also the potential for something much, much bigger. Since 1945, the US had become increasingly concerned about Soviet activity around Antarctica. As the Cold War began to take shape, the fear arose that Russians might park nuclear missiles on the continent, triggering a whole new arms race. By the time 1950 rolled around, diplomats were frantically trying to stop the temperature around Antarctica from reaching boiling point. People began urgently discussing how to demilitarize Antarctica. Another war was the last thing that anyone wanted, especially over some frozen rocks. Luckily, the sensible voices were about to get a massive boost. The International Geophysical Year, IGY, is something that's largely forgotten now, but was absolutely massive at the time. Running from July 1957 to December 1958, and yes, that's more than a year, very observant, the IGY was an unprecedented push to scientifically examine the entire Earth, with each set of data being released for any scientist in the world to study. As the least explored continent, Antarctica became a focal point for the IGY. 12 nations pledged to establish 50 overwinter bases. Everything from cosmic rays to glaciology to oceanography was to be studied in minute detail. At first, the countries trying to claim Antarctica were all like, guys, you can't do that on our turf. But, well, they were eventually convinced that it was all in the name of science, and slowly they began to work together. The cooperation seen on Antarctica during the IGY was so incredible that it shifted everyone's opinions. Suddenly, everyone wanted to maintain this newfound peace that had been found down south. On May 2, 1958, the US officially proposed keeping Antarctica solely for the purposes of scientific study. Barely a month later, the first meetings between the governments involved began. By December 1, 1959, the Antarctic Treaty had been born. Signed by Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, the USSR, Great Britain, and the USA, it established Antarctica as somewhere that could only be used for peaceful scientific purposes. Cleverly, it included something called Article 4, which stated that while the treaty did not annul previous claims, it did suspend them. It also stopped other nations from making any new claims. This meant that the nations that had already gone and planted their flags could sign the treaty without losing face. It was a fancy piece of diplomatic footwork. Even fancier was the clause that allowed all signatories to inspect one another's bases without limit. This meant the Soviets and Americans could drop in at any time and reassure themselves that the other wasn't installing nuclear missiles down south. Considering when this treaty was signed, this was an insane level of trust. Sputnik had just launched, a communist revolution had just overthrown Cuba's government, this was all going down. Yet here, East and West were sitting down and agreeing to cooperate over Antarctica. Today, there are 54 state parties to the Antarctica Treaty. In 1991, it was even amended to reflect environmental concerns, setting the stage for the continent to become the first global park. Nowadays, Antarctica is a continent devoid of cities, of permanent settlement, of exploitation. While the existence of places like bustling McMurdo Station means the modern world hasn't completely passed it by, the majority of Antarctica is still a mostly pristine wilderness, still a silent white desert, still essentially unchanged since the days of Scott and Amundsen. Sure, there are tourists now. Sure, you can take yoga classes down there or even go to Metallica gigs. Yes, really, they actually played there in 2013. But But unlike every other continent, Antarctica still hasn't lost its primal feel, the sensation that just by going there, you're standing on the edge of the Earth. It may not be a mystery any longer, but the southern continent is still a place capable of haunting our imaginations. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell so you find out when we put out a new video. Also, please do check out my other channel. It's called Biographic, sort of similar to this, but for people. Go check that out. And as always, thank you for watching.